Hello everyone, today the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine presents its last report in 2019 on the human rights situation in Ukraine, and I give the floor to Matilda Bogner, head of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine.
Good morning. On behalf of the UN Human Rights Office, I'm pleased to present our 28th periodic report today. The report covers the human rights situation in Ukraine between the 16th of August and the 15th of November this year. The report sets out key human rights developments and makes corresponding recommendations addressed to all relevant actors aimed at advancing human rights for all everywhere in Ukraine. The report is based on information collected and verified from a range of sources, including victims and witnesses of human rights violations on both sides of the contact line and in Crimea. The conflict continues to impact civilians in eastern Ukraine on a daily basis. During the reporting period, 6 civilians were killed and 36 were injured. The total number of civilian casualties in 2019 reached 162 as of the 15th of November, including 26 killed and 136 injured. This is a 40% decrease compared with the same calendar period of 2018 and the lowest figures for the entire conflict period. However, the death toll of the conflict on civilians keeps growing. Since mid-April 2014, when the conflict broke out, at least 3,344 civilians have been killed and more than 7,000 have been injured on both sides of the contact line. The parties to the conflict need, therefore, to do their utmost to bring the number of new civilian casualties to zero. It is therefore critical that the commitment to a full and comprehensive ceasefire by the end of the year announced in the communique of the Normandy 4 meeting of the 9th of December in Paris be implemented. We look forward to 2020 being the first year of the conflict with zero civilian casualties. We were also glad to learn that the National Strategy for the Protection of Civilians in Armed Conflict for the period until 2030 is about to be finalised. We hope it will be approved soon and then operationalised through its action plan. On International Children's Day on the 20th of November this year, Ukraine became the 100th country to endorse the Safe Schools Declaration. This follows recommendations from the UN Human Rights Office and its partners. Schools and kindergartens continue to suffer damage because of the conflict. We hope that this move will allow children living in the conflict zone to continue their education safely despite ongoing hostilities. Meanwhile, following long-term advocacy by the UN Human Rights Office and its partners, we've seen some developments to ease the burden of the conflict on civilians that extends beyond the immediate impact of hostilities. The completion of the repairs at Stanitsa-Luganska Bridge, the only crossing point in the entire Lugansk region, is an encouraging sign that change for the better can happen. Finally, those who cross there, particularly those with limited mobility, do not need to climb up and down steep, rickety wooden ramps. However, much more can and should be done to improve freedom of movement, including the opening of more crossing points, especially in the Lugansk region. This is in line with the communique of the Normandy 4 meeting, which speaks about the opening of new crossing points. In the same vein, we're encouraged by the Cabinet of Ministers resolution on the 28th of November that should facilitate crossings at entry-exit checkpoints. Children under the age of 14 will no longer require a passport to cross the contact line, only a birth certificate. Another long-awaited positive development is a draft law on pensions, 2083D, that received cross-party support and has been registered. The adoption of the law would simplify the process for the payment of pensions to those living on the other side of the contact line, no longer requiring crossings every 60 days, and start a process of paying their pension arrears. We look forward to seeing the law adopted. We have also observed a number of positive developments in the sphere of remedy and reparation to civilian victims of the conflict, such as a budget allocation for the first time since 2014 to compensate for property damaged and destroyed due to the conflict. Though this allocation is modest and too small for existing needs, it is a move in the right direction. We have also noted a number of court decisions on compensation for the loss of civilian lives to survivors. Most important is that an all-encompassing draft law, number 1115, on remedy and reparation for civilians who have suffered as a result of armed conflict was registered. Supported across party lines, this is an encouraging sign that the voices of those affected have reached Kiev. We hope the draft will be improved and adopted in 2020. We are alarmed to keep receiving allegations of killings and extrajudicial executions on both sides of the contact line during the reported period, including a death in custody of a Ukrainian soldier in Makiivka penal colony in October. Circumstances surrounding the case raise suspicions that his death may have been violent. When a killing or extrajudicial execution occurs, investigations must be prompt, impartial, and effective, with perpetrators brought to account, regardless of the identity of the victim or the perpetrator. Torture and ill-treatment is also an ongoing concern. We have documented cases of arbitrary arrests, detentions, torture, and ill-treatment occurring in government-controlled territory, in territory controlled by the self-proclaimed republics, as well as in the Russian Federation. International law is clear. Such treatment can never be justified. A ban on torture and ill-treatment is absolute. Let me emphasize that when torture and ill-treatment or other rights violated are committed, accountability must follow. Lack of accountability creates conditions for further violations. Unfortunately, we see that even in the most high-profile cases of killings and violent deaths in Maidan and on the 2nd of May 2014 in Odessa, accountability has still not been achieved. We welcome the transfer of the investigating team covering the Maidan investigations from the prosecutor's office to the State Bureau of Investigation, envisaged in the recently adopted amendments to the law on the SBI. We hope that this will preserve the institutional memory of the investigations and avoid further delays. However, the most important issue is to see real progress in these cases. Victims and their families are calling for truth and justice. Closely related to accountability is the question of administration of justice and fundamental fair trial guarantees. Undue delay in trials in conflict-related cases is a major concern. In more than 30 cases that we followed during the reporting period, defendants have been held in pre-trial detention for more than 3 years due to delays in trial processes. These are often caused by misconduct of prosecutors and judges' failure to ensure prompt proceedings. The pattern of protracted trials, especially at the local level, is further aggravated by the lack of judges caused by delays in their appointment in the wake of judicial reforms. The UN Human Rights Office therefore calls for the judicial reform process to address this issue. Free legal aid provided to defendants in conflict-related proceedings is sometimes of low quality, especially when individuals are first apprehended. We are concerned by complaints that legal aid lawyers are failing in their duty to defend their clients effectively. Therefore, the Coordination Centre for Free Legal Aid Provision should further develop and improve the system for periodic assessment of their legal services. Protection of civic space and fundamental freedoms is another key focus for the UN Human Rights Office. The report details some of the 16 new attacks which occurred over the last 3 months, including against journalists, members of the LGBTI community, and civil society. These attacks must be promptly and impartially investigated. Perpetrators should be prosecuted regardless of their identity. It is important that the motives of the attacks are taken into account when prosecuting perpetrators to ensure that their punishment reflects the gravity of the crime that they committed. I would also like to emphasize the importance of ensuring and protecting an environment where different and opposing views can be shared and debated freely. We are particularly concerned about how the law on combating disinformation, required by the Presidential Decree 837 of 2019 of the 8th of November this year, will be drafted, as such a law could contravene Ukraine's obligations in relation to freedom of opinion, expression, and information. We caution the government from placing disproportionate restrictions on freedom of expression and the media. In territory controlled by self-proclaimed republics, we have observed the absence of critical media content, limiting residents to express their views on the only platform available to them, the social media. The right to assemble peacefully is equally important. We monitored pride marches in Odessa and Kharkiv, as well as the transgender march in Kiev after the reporting period. We commend the police on their overall securing of the exercise of freedom of expression and assembly at these marches. Still, we documented a total of 8 attacks against representatives of the LGBTI community, including in the context of these marches, and we strongly urge the authorities to carry out investigations into the attacks against individuals belonging to the LGBTI community and prosecution of the perpetrators. In territory controlled by self-proclaimed republics, the UN Human Rights Office has been informed that organizations and civil society activists representing the LGBTI community refrain from public displays as they fear persecution, and many have had to flee for this reason. Regarding the law on state language, we are concerned that the Cabinet of Ministers and the Parliament have not yet begun to elaborate a draft law on the realisation of the rights of Indigenous peoples and national minorities. Priority should be given to this in order to ensure the effective protection of language rights of linguistic minorities. The draft law should be prepared in an inclusive and consultative process. We note that the law on state languages sets out that the Cabinet of Ministers must submit this draft law to the Parliament by January 2020. We also take note of the opinion of the Venice Commission, published on the 9th of December, which confirms the concerns raised by our office in this and previous reports. We urge the authorities to take fully into account its recommendations and confirm our readiness to assist the government in its implementation. In relation to Crimea, our report presents findings from interviews with individuals from Crimea who were simultaneously released from the Russian Federation on the 7th of September this year. Some of these detainees reported torture and ill treatment to coerce them to testify against themselves or others. We also conducted monitoring visits to the administrative boundary line and were pleased to observe the construction to improve conditions at the crossing points of the administrative boundary line with Crimea. I also take a minute to highlight that the operations of the UN Human Rights Office in territory controlled by the self-proclaimed republics are severely restricted, and urge that the UN Human Rights Office be allowed unimpeded, confidential access to places of detention and detainees. This is particularly important in light of the recent death in custody in Donetsk. In this context, we note that the communiqué of the Normandy 4 also addressed the need for international organisations to be granted full and unconditional access to all detained persons. We hope that this will also provide further impetus to allow such access. In Crimea, despite repeated requests, the Russian Federation has not yet granted the UN Human Rights Office access to the peninsula. We call on Russia to facilitate access as it would help to strengthen protection for persons in vulnerable situations and would send a positive message to the international community. Much has happened over the past few months, and indeed in the last few weeks since we finalised our report. I am heartened by the efforts made to improve the situation of the conflict-affected people, but until the conflict ends, people will continue to suffer, and until the ceasefire truly holds, they will continue to be killed and injured, to say nothing of the traumatic and long-lasting effects of living in a conflict zone. Accountability remains a crucial element to ensuring all other rights. It must be ensured for past violations as well as for those that are yet to occur. It must be applied regardless of the affiliation of the perpetrator and the identity of the victim. Remedy for all victims is equally important. As we are nearing the end of the year, we look forward to 2020, which will be an important year for human rights. With the holding of local elections and the expected adoption of the new National Human Rights Action Plan and Strategy, and the next strategy on the protection and integration of the Roma community into Ukrainian society. Ukraine will also undergo a voluntary national review of the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, which are a vehicle not only for development but also for human rights. We urge that these processes be carried out in an inclusive and transparent manner to allow the voices of all in Ukraine to be heard. We stand ready to provide support on this and more as needed. Thank you.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, if you have questions, please ask them. І представляйтесь, будь ласка.
And please introduce yourself. Елена Бережная. I'm director of Institute for Legal Policy and Social Protection, named after Irina Berezhnaya. I have this question to you. In your report, you mention that Verkhovna Rada is preparing a special law on pensions for those who live in uncontrolled territories. However, after you have come to the mission, for some reason, they start ignoring those court litigations, the rulings that were obtained by our institute back in 2019 at all the three levels, and it was confirmed by the High Administrative Court of Ukraine. And Mr. Aretunyan used to deal with that starting from 2014. We continued working in that area with Fiona Fraser. It was covered in all the reports, and there was the ruling on enforcement. That was to withdraw Resolution 595 of 2014, when they suspended financing going to that territory. And in the court ruling, there was the explanation of the mechanism without bringing money there, using ATM network. The court explained how it would be possible to transfer the money, how people could have access to the money. And it was explained that that is the rule of those people. This is the right of these people. And it was explained how it could work. Ivan Shimanovich, being Assistant to Secretary General, on the 4th of December, touched upon this issue at the UN General Assembly, and the decision was made, and Ukraine undertook the commitment to enforce, to implement the court resolution of October 2014. And until now, it has not been implemented. This covers not only pensioners, but all socially vulnerable groups of citizens. These are for Chernobyl veterans, for families of repressed people, etc. So this is about payment for socially, or allowances for socially vulnerable groups of citizens. For some reason, you just ignore that ruling, even though the European Court for Human Rights allocated the term till the end November for Ukraine to enforce, to implement this ruling, because if it is not implemented, well, our Institute back in 2016 appealed to court representing 15 families. And now the court made its ruling, but somehow it's not addressed by the UN monitoring mission. So could you please explain why? And also you mentioned that there is some progress in considering the so-called Heavenly 100 case. Are you going to analyze the materials and documents, including interrogation protocols, those that are on the systemic basis published by the blogger and media expert by Anatoly Shary, where they prove that almost half of members of Heavenly 100 had nothing to do with the crimes committed in Maidan, that those were psychically ill, mentally ill people who died of TB, of some other diseases that have nothing to do with the events in Maidan. So do you approve and support the decision on transferring those investigators to the State Investigation Bureau? But during these 6 years, they have been falsifying these investigations, and they deemed more than half of people as heroes of the Heavenly 100, of those who had nothing to do with that. Now we are in the process of corresponding with the Fatubin-Suda, with the court in Hague, starting from 2014. So what is the reaction on your side to that? And also, there is the decision of the Venice Commission on the law on language and on education. But the Ukrainian government is not implementing this recommendation of the Venice Commission. You're just recommending that they implement that. Unless till the end of the year, the law is introduced on national minorities. If they don't implement recommendations of the Venice Commission, are you the monitoring mission within your mandate via the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, where that resolution was adopted at the 12th session? I was there at the Forum of National Minorities, and they extended the recommendations. So are you going to initiate consideration of non-performance, non-fulfillment of international commitments by Ukraine at the UN's General Assembly to introduce some sanctions against the officials in Ukraine? Thank you.
In relation to the pension and the pension law and the fact that the courts have issued decisions, we are working on this issue constantly, and we have called on the government to implement those decisions. But we do see that the draft law on pensions that is currently before the Parliament is a good step in the right direction. If it will be implemented, it will help to ensure the payment of pensions, including arrears, so debt that is due to people. We will continue to work on that, and it's not only our office, it's the UN at large within Ukraine that is advocating on this point and is trying to make progress. In relation to the killings in Maidan and in Odessa, we are, again, working constantly to try to encourage the government and to provide technical advice and so on to get full and effective investigations into those deaths. We fully acknowledge that it has not been effective so far and that there have been a lot of problems, and that's why we continue to advocate on these issues. In relation to the Venice Commission, the decision on the language law just came out on Monday this week. Again, we call on the authorities to look at that decision, which is very much in line with our own analysis, and to review the law as well as to put in place a law on the rights of minorities and their language rights. we, as an office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, would not be the appropriate body to take something to the General Assembly. That is for member states to do. Thank you.
More questions? If there is no more questions from media representatives, thank you.